Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. Will the $42.5 billion that's going to be coming from the BEAD program for broadband be enough to close the digital divide? Some say no. Some say it's not even close. Be right back. Thanks for joining me, Rick Uzzi here with the Quorum for Broadband Deployment News. So I've seen a couple of things recently where people are questioning whether the money from BEAD, and it's about $42.45 billion, whether that's going to be enough to close the digital divide, because a lot of people have said, this is really kind of an unprecedented amount of money that we're allocating for broadband. A lot of people have said this is, once in a generation. Some say a once in a lifetime. Some should say it's a once kind of fund that we're going to be seeing. So what happens if it's not enough? So there's some people that are concerned about that. So I was going to talk about that today, look at one particular article. If you maybe are familiar with the Pots and Pans blog, this is from Doug Dawson, who is with CCG Consulting, basically. This is his consulting company. So he does a lot of good work on this blog, talks about a lot of the issues, and this is what he's bringing up here today, or when he posted this back on the 14th. So one of the biggest questions, he says, associated with the $42.5 billion BEAD grant program is that enough money to solve the national rural digital divide? He talks about how it's going to be allocated. Of course, every state's going to get a certain amount of money. Everybody gets a minimum of $100 million. And then depending on how many unserved areas they have, then they get additional money on top of that. It says here, the funding works out to be around $850 million per state. Not sure where he got that, but the funding will vary significantly by state, so maybe that's kind of an average. Preliminary estimates have a number of states getting only 100 million. So these are going to be your smaller states that are more densely populated, so they have fewer people in rural areas, so they don't have as many people that are unserved. So you've got states like Connecticut, Delaware, District of Columbia, Hawaii, surprisingly, Maine, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Rhode Island, and Vermont. So some of those I would think they might have more rural areas, but I guess maybe he's looked at something there, or whoever else has estimated that. The largest estimated locations are estimated to go through, allocations are estimated to go to Texas at $4.2 billion and California at $2.8 billion. And of course, these are really big states, lots of people. Texas, lots of people, but lots of land. California, also lots of land. I think Alaska would probably be getting a lot fewer people to cover, but they've got lots of middle mile infrastructure that they can apply these funds towards, and they do have, I'm sure, lots of unserved people in the state as well. So it is going to vary by state, again, depending on how many unserved folks they have, how many people they have, and then how many of those people are unserved, and how much real estate there is to cover, because that's really a big part of the cost is how many customers are there per mile, or how many miles are there per customer, sometimes is really what it works out to in these rural areas. Says the state of Minnesota is estimated to receive about $650 million in BEAD grant funding. He mentions the fact that there's not a lot of information about what states are getting, but I did a broadcast about this a while back when Minnesota announced that they had come up with a number, and I think actually the number they got was from the NTIA. It sounded to me like the NTIA was going to the states and saying, hey, here's where we think you might fall, so you can start to do some initial planning based on that. And Minnesota announced that amount. I haven't seen any other announcements. That's what he's saying here. But he says the state of Minnesota is estimated to receive about $650 million in BEAD grant funding. In March of this year, the state legislature approved $110 million for the existing border-to-border grant program, with most of the funding coming from federal ARPA funding given to the state. That's the American Rescue Plan Act. At that time, the state broadband office estimated that the state will need around $1.3 billion in total grant funding to reach everybody in the state. If that's a good estimate, then after BEAD grants and the $110 million state grants, the state will be $40 million short. Now, I don't know if they've allocated everything that they have available through ARPA. I can't remember from that article if it mentioned that. So there might be more ARPA money coming. And there's other money coming. In fact, USDA just announced hundreds of millions of dollars, I believe. I'll talk about that tomorrow or Monday for the Reconnect program. So there's still money out there, other federal money in programs like USDA Reconnect as well. But he's making the point here that if their estimates are correct, then what they're going to get through BEAD is not going to be nearly enough. And he raises some questions here. He said this raises a lot of questions. First, inflation has hit the broadband industry hard, and I've seen a lot of estimates that the cost to build broadband networks is between 15 to 25% higher than just 2 years ago. And you can certainly see that. If you go to the grocery store, you know about inflation, right? Go to the gas pump, you know about inflation. And that gas alone impacts everything, right? It impacts food prices, but it also impacts the cost of transportation of things. So, and the cost of production because you're transporting materials, those kinds of things. So that's a big deal. Now, gas has been coming down as the economy cools. You know, the Fed raised rates today, so this is going to continue to cool the economy as the economy cools, and we slip further into a recession. We really are in a recession, even though I don't want to admit it. So we're in a recession. So as we slip further into a recession, the economy slows down, gas prices drop when the economy slows down. So we could be seeing benefits from that, as well as these interest rate hikes that inflation could be going down. And if inflation goes down, then maybe some of these things will be mitigated over time, right? But yeah, there's been a lot of big increase in costs here recently. This also raises the question of how much inflation will further increase costs over the years it's going to take to build out BEAD-funded networks. It's not hard to imagine BEAD networks still being constructed in 2026 and beyond. And that's true, although again, inflation is what it is today. It is going up, but it's going up slower, and it could actually start to come down as the Fed takes these actions, and again, as we see gas prices dropping because of the cooling of the economy. So maybe it won't be quite so bad in the future, hopefully, and it could actually come down from where it is today, within, let's say, 2026. I've also seen estimates that the rules established by Congress and the NTIA for the BEAD grants could add as much as another 15% to the cost of building broadband networks compared to somebody not using grant funds. It talks about things like requirement to pay prevailing wages, expensive environmental studies. Yeah, paying prevailing wages, I mean, you've got to do that in order to get people. But there's requirements in there for diversity, hiring diversity. There's requirements in there for hiring or using, they really want you to use labor, labor groups, those kinds of things, union labor. Because again, this is a Democrat bill, so they're putting things in there that would be for their base. Environmental studies, climate resiliency of the broadband network, or things that are in here that are going to add to the costs. And as far as hiring, there's going to be a lot of people needed. So it won't matter what color you are, what race or gender you are. If you're qualified and you can get trained, then you can find work, and you will find work at a good wage because there's going to be a demand for people. That's the way the free market works. That's what I expect to happen. So the only, again, a limiting factor here is whether these people have to then be, joined a labor union, and does that drive up wage costs? And that's going to make, all those things make the dollars don't go as far, right? So if you've got so much to build broadband and you're putting a lot of them to environmental studies and, how you're going to hire people and making sure that those kinds of things, it's going to make the money go less far. So that's the point he's making here. He mentions the requirement for getting certified letter of credit. And the reason the NTI wants to do that is to make sure that they did this with CAF2, I believe, and certainly for RDOF, where whoever is going to get this money needs to make sure that they have a letter of credit that says they're good for being able to spend all the funds they need to spend to build it. Because they're not just getting this money; they've got to put in at least 75% of the money here that they've got to be able to spend. So there's a point to that, although again, that's an extra cost that will limit possibly some smaller providers that might have a problem getting that kind of letter of credit. The extra grant related costs and the general inflation in the industry might mean that BEAD project costs could do 30% or more than building the same network 2 years ago without grant funding. So he certainly has the point that inflation right now is taking its toll, and then you've got these other costs on top that are not really related to putting in a quality broadband network. The amount of money that you're going to have to spend on these programs, climate resiliency, is going to have minimal, if any, impact on the environment. It's just the fact of life. But you've got to check that box in this particular grant thing, getting these grants. You got to do the same for making sure that you're seeking out a diverse workforce. But again, anybody who wants to get these jobs that hopefully can get trained in some way. There's lots of training that's going to be out there. Will be able to get jobs doing this. Minnesota's allocation of $110 million to broadband from ARPA is smaller than what many other states have done. So he talks about North Carolina. His state allocated nearly $1 billion of the state's ARPA money to broadband, and there are many states that have allocated $300 million or more. I think my state, Georgia's done more than $300 million for ARPA. So he's saying here that maybe Minnesota, they bear part of the blame in that they didn't apply enough of their ARPA funds to broadband. They put it in other areas. But again, I don't know if they exhausted all of their ARPA money yet. So maybe he knows that. I just don't know that for sure. Another interesting question to be addressed is how state broadband offices will deal with areas where a 75% grant's not enough for an ISP to make a business case. From the feasibility work I've been doing this year, I think there are a lot more areas that fit the high cost category than might be expected. So there are going to be these really high cost areas, and service providers are going to be looking at this and going, if we have to put in a 25% match, does that even help us make an economic sense? Now, there are these high cost areas where the state with, working with the NTI can get 100% of that being a grant. So that is a potential, but that is something that, you do have these really high cost areas that you have to take into account. Finally, there are going to be areas where a state doesn't make a BEAD grant award. It's not hard to imagine a situation where only one ISP asked to serve an area, and a state broadband office decides that the ISP is unqualified to receive funding. It's not hard to imagine, although I don't see that happening, because in most areas you've got some kind of a provider that's either already providing service, but they can't make an economic case. It could be a provider that's providing DSL service and fiber service, but they can't make a case to run fiber to some outlying areas. Well, they already have experience in that area, so they're going to be qualified. You have cable operators that are doing DOCSIS, and they could maybe edge out in another area, but it's not feasible for them to do fiber to go out to those further out homes. But if they get funding, it would make sense. So I think there will be people in every area, and certainly through maybe public-private partnerships. You've got electric membership co-ops in some areas that cover vast areas of where they could partner with companies, and several people together would have the experience to do this. So I don't foresee that being a problem. It's like he says, it's not hard to imagine, but I think it's less likely that that's not going to be the case. If Minnesota estimate is even roughly accurate, it's likely that Minnesota won't be the only state that doesn't receive enough BEAD money to get broadband to everybody. We're not going to know this for sure until ISPs start applying for grants, but it won't be a surprise if the BEAD grants are not large enough. And he's not the only one who thinks this. There are others out there. In fact, there's Vantage Point Solutions. You might want to check out this white paper. So they are saying that, based on their experience, that this is not even close to being enough. In fact, the CEO of Vantage Point, Larry Thompson, was supposed to be on Broadband Breakfast with Gary Bolton, and that was actually supposed to be yesterday, where they were going to talk about this white paper. They were going to go through what they found and what it was all based on, but that had to be postponed. So you might be looking for that in the future, that they're going to do that video stream, that live stream, to explain this white paper. But I'll go ahead at the end of this. I'll post a link to Doug's article, and I'll post a link to this as well if you want to download this white paper and read what they say about it. And what they came up with was, they've said that, for various reasons, they mentioned the inflation as a big primary reason that this may not happen. They also talk about just underestimating the number of people that are unserved and underserved, or in some cases, just looking at 25 by 3 and saying that, and just counting those numbers, and not people that are under 100 by 20. And 100 by 20 is really kind of the definition of broadband now. The FCC's come out and pretty much said, hey, it's 100 by 20, and you know what, we'd really like a gig by 500 as our kind of our future goal, because the target changes, right? So that's the problem, is that broadband years ago at 4 by 1 was like, hey, that's good broadband. These days, that's terrible, right? So 25 by 3 is terrible now, and 100 by 20 is reasonable, but it won't be long before 100 by 20, and people are saying, wow, that's too slow. So it's a moving target. But that's one of the things, is they say that we're undercounting underserved and unserved, so they think there's far more areas. I think that's not the case, only because there have been so many areas that are being covered right now by people that are putting in their own investment to put in fiber, or that have been using ARPA funds or USDA Connect funds, or that are getting RDOF funds to be able to serve these areas. So I think all of these, I think the areas that need to be served is shrinking. And I think it's shrinking really fast. And then you throw in 5G, which a lot of people don't talk about, but you've got the major carriers like T-Mobile and Verizon and AT&T, especially T-Mobile with all of the spectrum that they have, and they're rolling out 5G on a nationwide basis. And 5G is going to get you over that 100 by 20 mark. So right there, you've got areas that maybe they've got DSL and they've got, 10 by 1 service, but then T-Mobile comes in and suddenly they've got well over 100 by over 20 upstream using a 5G mid-band spectrum mobile kind of service. So I really think there will be actually fewer underserved and unserved areas when you factor all of this in. Plus you factor how long it's going to take to get this money, eventually get this money out there. Again, you've got ARPA funds, RDOF funds, USDA Connect, plus because of all the money that's out there, you've got service providers who are saying, you know what, we've kind of not been doing this area because it would be expensive for us, but we better get out there now. If we better either apply for funds or we better get out there now and start building so that we lock somebody else out. So we don't want a competitor to come in an adjacent area or an area where we serve, where we have, let's say, DSL service and we don't have good fiber service, or we've got, fixed wireless that's not licensed spectrum. We need to get fiber out there, something like that. They may be actually wanting to foot the bill themselves and get that in place, again, to be able to get that area covered and off of the map when those maps are finally determined. And when that happens, I think the NTIA said they're not going to be looking at they're not going to be making a determination based on the FCC maps that come out in November. They don't think those are going to be accurate enough, is the last thing I heard. So while there will supposedly be maps out in November from the FCC, that's going to be based on the data that ISPs have uploaded into the broadband fabric, and some are still uploading. I don't know if the FCCs, they're still accepting that data. So they haven't cut that off yet. But at some point they're going to cut that off, then they're going to be using that data, but there's going to be a lot of challenges to that data because a lot of people were looking at that. I did a survey and a blog post about that recently. I'll go ahead and post a link to that as well, if I remember here at the end. Did a survey recently that showed that broadband fabric data was not necessarily that accurate. A lot of people were struggling with that. They were struggling with addresses. Plus, they were struggling with the whole process to get the information in there. So anyway, again, I'll link to this so you can check that white paper out. And Larry Thompson is supposed to be a guest on a upcoming Broadband for Breakfast. So I'm sure they're going to reschedule that. So go check out Fiber Broadband, the Fiber Broadband Association. Sign up for those weekly Wednesday video streams if you're interested in those. There's a lot of good information there from Gary Bolton and the folks that he interviews. So, all right, well, hopefully this was interesting and helpful for you. If so, give me a thumbs up on the video. Go ahead and click subscribe and click the little bell to be notified when I'm live. I'm live every day, and I will see you tomorrow for Broadband Deployment News. Take care. Bye-bye.